Okay, I am Arthur Watts Clark, born in Seattle, Washington on the 28th of November of 1922, I think at the Swedish hospital. So I was there as a very small child. Not long thereafter, several things happened in our family that were dramatic. Number one, we got a little tuberculosis because the man from whom we bought milk had an inspected herd, but he got short of milk and borrowed milk from a neighbor, which was contaminated with tuberculosis, and that led my brother to spend 6 years in bed and more on crutches and wheelchairs, and I had a little in my lungs. So anyway, I was 3 at the time. My mother had taken my brother to a sanitarium, and my father was driving a car. We were hit by a woman who had just gotten out of an insane asylum. My grandmother was killed and I was hurt and so on. So this all happened when I was 3 years old. My parents go back for a long time in Europe. They had both been there before the turn of the century, before 1900. And my father used to talk about Paris, where his mother was a painter, a portrait painter, or oil painter. And those were days when there were no electricity in Paris and no vehicles, motor vehicles in Paris. Then my parents met each other in World War I when my father was in the Army. I think he was driving an ambulance. My mother was with the American Red Cross. So they got acquainted, and they were in Paris on Armistice Day on November 11th, 1918. They were married in Durham, North Carolina, actually, in 1919, where my mother's cousin lived, and they had just gotten back from Europe. They had stayed over there in 1919, working with refugees, my father in the Pyrenees. Then they went out to Seattle, where my father had built a home with his 2 brothers in 1912. That home still stands. And that home just sold for an astronomical amount of money to a wealthy, obviously wealthy gentleman from Hong Kong, a Chinese gentleman. So the old home is still there. In 1926, we moved to France and Switzerland. There was a doctor that my father knew who had a TB sanitarium that was supposed to be the best place in the world to get a cure. And he wanted my brother there. My father was totally bilingual, and he was an attorney. So in 1926, we got over there and actually were in Paris for a little while before going to Switzerland. I always like to say that we got there before Lindbergh did. So we were there until the end of 1932. So I got my early schooling in public schools in France and Switzerland, where you worked very hard and you went 6 days a week. And the result was, when we moved back to the United States, I skipped a grade. And I was much the youngest kid in my class. So then we were in Seattle. I was in Seattle now, 1933 to 1939, when I graduated from Lakeside School, which got notoriety when Bill Gates went there. My brother and I both went there. And in 1939, I came to the University of North Carolina and started school and was in the class of 1943, but I finished in 1942. And in 1942, I was 19 years old, and I finished Carolina, and I enlisted in the Army Air Forces and got married. Moved out of Old East Dormitory and rented an apartment. Subsequently, my career in the Air Force started. I went through aviation cadet training in Boca Raton, Florida. I went through technical school at Yale in aerial photography. I had an interesting experience there. People always talk about celebrities. I was the commander of the cadets in our detachment, and we had been in the gym working out, and so I was following them out in formation on the sidewalk, getting them in formation to march back to class, and a limousine pulled up. And out of the limousine came a two-star general. I'd never seen a general, hardly ever heard of a general. And he opened the back door, and the three-star general also appeared then, and with him was a gentleman wearing a Homburg, wearing a derby. And I was, standing at attention. I had my whole unit at attention. I was hitting a brace. I didn't know what to do, scared to death. And the gentleman in the civilian clothes came up to me, took his hat off, bowed to me, and said, "Good morning, sir." And I knew he was pulling my leg. I had sense enough to know that. But I had no idea who it was. Well, it was the former King of England. So that was an interesting experience. Anyhow, I got commissioned in 1943 and went immediately to intelligence school, which was at Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, in a boys' school, boys' academy. When I finished intelligence school, I went to Will Rogers Field in Oklahoma City, which is now the head of the FAA, that's their base. And I had anticipated being there a month or more. My wife and my new baby came out to be with me. And in about a week, I was told, "You're being assigned to the 35th Photo Reconnaissance Squadron and heading overseas." And the reason for that was that the person whose job I was taking in the squadron had developed measles, and he could not go and infect everybody, of course. So at this point, I was assigned to the 35th Photo Reconnaissance Squadron and to get ready to go overseas. And I was with that squadron as long as it was in China, and it came home right at the end of the war, and I was reassigned then along with the engineering officer and the photo officer to the other reconnaissance outfit in China, the 21st Photo Reconnaissance Squadron. My brother had got a national scholarship to Harvard. They gave 6 in the 7 western states. I assumed I would likely could. We had both been valedictorians in our lakeside classes. But my mother's cousin, who lived in Durham, was Annie Watts Hill. She and my mother were both only children and kind of grew up together. And my cousin here, whose name was Watts Hill, George Watts Hill, was the same generation as me, but I was born in 1922 and he was born in 1901. He was the oldest of the generation and I was the youngest. And he was very high on the University of North Carolina, and my parents were very familiar with Frank Graham, knowing they knew a lot about him, and I was persuaded that this would be a good place to come. That first year was interesting because my family was, my mother wondered what I was going to do for Christmas. Well, now the little local history, Mr. George Washington Watts, who was affiliated with the Dukes in the tobacco business, was my grandfather's brother. My maternal grandfather was a physician who died in his 20s of pneumonia. And that was back in the days where you didn't have to have a college degree to be a physician. I've got his big Latin diploma, but I don't know whether he went to undergraduate work or not. But anyway, that Christmas, Annie Watts Hill made a suggestion to her father's second wife, I think. Her father's wife had died. He married her nurse. Her nurse, when he died, married the former governor of North Carolina, Cameron, and they had a place called Morrowcroft in Charlotte, an estate with deer on the farm, which is now downtown Charlotte. So I went over as a young kid and spent Christmas vacation at Morrowcroft with Cameron Morrison and his wife Sarah. And he just used me to listen to his stories. And the one that has always remembered with me is sort of an unusual story. He was a very modest man, actually, for an ex-governor, and he always referred to his wife's money about their estate. Her father had left $10 million to his only daughter, Annie, and $10 million to his second wife. And $10 million was a lot of money in those days. So he told me this, that the first time he met Sarah, or first time he went out with her, she picked him up for this date in a Rolls Royce with a chauffeur, and they were sitting in the back seat. And he said the windows were so clean he thought they were open, and he let a wad of tobacco go out, and of course it hit inside the window, and he said he thought he'd never see her again. But she came back, he said, and there was a brass cuspidor in the back seat. So he knew he was in good shape. Well, this was part of my education, part of the liberal arts end of the university. So anyhow, I spent my time at the university, majored in geology. In summers, I worked in the National Park Service, the Olympic National Park in the state of Washington. And the last summer, 1942, 3 of us from the geology department satisfied our requirements for a field geology course by taking jobs that were jointly funded by the state of North Carolina Department of Conservation and Development and the Tennessee Valley Authority to look for copper in some old copper developments, because the price of copper had gone up to 16 cents a pound in the war. So we worked from Ore Knob up on the Virginia border down to a mine that is now underwater at the Fontana Dam site, which had been a Civil War mine. We recommended 2 properties, and they were both reopened during the war. So that satisfied that summer, but I had been the previous summer on the North Fork of the Quinault River in the Olympic Mountains. Well, I wanted to get in service, you know. I think everybody did. And actually, first I went over to Raleigh, and I thought I could get into naval aviation because I like ships, and I thought that would be fun, flying off on and off carriers and so on. And they said, with your eyesight the way it is, you not only can't get naval aviation, you can't get in the Navy. Well, I thought, my God, I know I can get in service. So I came back and I went to McPherson's Hospital in Durham. Dr. McPherson examined my eyes and he said, your eyes are not very good, but you're not colorblind, which would keep you from flying. But he said, the fact of the matter is, a lot of people have been coming here like you. The Navy is not recruiting anybody right now. They're full up on their training. So I went back to Raleigh, to the Air Force, to see if I could get into aviation. And they said, and I think the reason was that the Air Force rules, the Navy rules at that time, were all sort of old rules that existed when everything was open cockpit. If you wore glasses, you weren't going to fly. Your glasses might fly up. Anyway, the Air Force said you can't fly, but you can go into aviation cadet ground school and become a technical specialist. Eventually, I have flown an Air Force twin-engine jet from here to Los Angeles and back, but I never was rated as a pilot. That was after I was a general in intelligence. They let me do that. When I came back from the service in 1946, I was the ranger on the East Fork of the Quinault River. I had an opportunity to go into Rainier National Park as a ranger naturalist. So I spent that summer there. Then that fall I went to Berkeley. I had gotten out of the service, went to Berkeley, got a graduate degree in geology there, and decided that I was not going to teach. So I'd gotten my master's degree. My thesis was to do a geological map of part of the Napa Valley where the wine business was just getting a foothold. And I decided I was not going to teach, and I looked at job opportunities, several, one in Seattle, one in Michigan, and one down here with George Watts, with Watts Hill. So I came down here in February. I remember it very well. I flew in here in February of 1948 and landed with 14 inches of snow in Durham. And I was in the DC-3. And I remember when I got on the DC-3 in Seattle, it's the first time I'd ever been in an airplane without a parachute. And I asked the stewardess, the flight attendant, where are the parachutes? And she said, we don't need parachutes. Well, that was good. So then I got started with the Home Security Life Insurance Company. In 1950, we got another war. Newspapers said they were going to recall people after 1 month notification. I was notified to show up within a week down at Maxwell Field, because they took all of the people who had intelligence experience in China, which was not many people, and recalled them immediately. So I got back into service through the Korean War, and then got back out again, but stayed in the active reserve, because I figured if they're going to call me back, I might as well be working my way up the ladder. Oh, I remember my first job very well. I was a powder monkey. And I grew up on this peninsula. There are 3 peninsulas together like 3 fingers on the east side of Lake Washington. And I could walk from the peninsula I was on to the next peninsula over. And there was a man there by the name of Mr. Tremper, who had a holly farm, English holly farm. The English holly will grow in Seattle or in Vancouver. It won't grow around here. It's a beautiful shiny leaf with berries. And every year, through the Depression, he continued to do well. He would harvest the holly in November or whatever, and using a Nisei, American Japanese, particularly historically, for the cutting and making the wreaths, and women and school boys on vacation or school children on vacation to do the wrapping and packing and the sprays that were sent all over the world, the sprays and the wreaths. And Mr. Tremper wanted to develop 4 more acres of farm, and so he was hired a fellow by the name of Roy Evans to do the land clearing, and this was big trees. So I got a job with Roy Evans, and I was paid 25 cents a week, 48 hours a week. And my job, in addition to working on the cutting, we would cut some big cedar trees and cut them into fence posts and so on. But we blasted stumps. You used a 20% dynamite, not 40%, not like you're blasting in a mine. And you put them under the stump to raise the stump up to where it would be split open, and then you would start it burning, and it would eventually burn itself out, and then you could pull the rest of it out with a donkey engine. And my job was to work with these sticks of dynamite, and I remember putting, I think, 3 dozen under one huge stump. And you weren't supposed to carry blasting caps and dynamite in the same truck. But I remember I was going, this was a 1930 Chevrolet pickup, and I would sit in the back on the cases of dynamite and hold the blasting caps, and he said, if I slam on the brakes suddenly or something, you throw those blasting caps away as far as you can. And I remember one man that worked with us who was an awful looking old fellow. He had some kind of terrible dermatitis, and he was old as Santa Claus, you know. And what he used to do, instead of using our pliers that you use for crimping blasting caps that are so designed that you won't press the wrong place or press too hard, he would crimp them in his teeth. And we kept backing up whenever he was doing any crimping, expecting to see the explosion, but he knew what he was doing apparently. Well, that was my first job, and I subsequently had a job as a Boilermaker's assistant. I was a member of the Boilermakers Union at the Lake Washington shipyard, which was also walking distance from home, 4 miles, something like that. I'd walk to work in the morning and then work in the shipyard and then walk back. And I worked on a thing called the rolls, which would roll these states of boilerplate, of armor plate, and then the thing is called a big press, and then you took a sledgehammer and did the final shaping of the boilerplate to the template, to the plywood template. From there, I went directly into cadets. So that was at the start of the war, and those were my first jobs. And I remember the shipyard job. I can remember vividly because I've thought about it many times. We were paid $200 a month. I remember telling my father if they kept paying people $200 a month, it would break the country. At the Park Service, I was getting $110 a month, and I charged $10 a month for my ranger station, I think. But $200 a month sounded like an awful lot of money, and was in those days compared to what people had been making. We did quite a few things together. He had a fused leg. It came out of his tuberculosis. He had this huge abscess, and I can remember seeing my mother changing dressings on his leg when we were on the ship going to France. And I didn't realize then that she had seen the things she had seen. I got a letter that she wrote back in December of 1918 and said that she was at a 100-bed hospital, and they brought 3,000 casualties in that day, I think in the Battle of the Marne. But this leg, he was on crutches, and when we got back at the end of the 32, he went to Johns Hopkins, and two orthopedists, Dr. Bennett and Dr. Baer, operated on his leg. They removed the patella, and as I understood it, they cut slices out of the patella and cut slots into the tibia and femur and fused his leg with a 2-degree bend or something. And he wore a shoe that was about 1.5 inches thick on the sole, thereabout. So if he was going up a hill, he always led with his left leg, which would bend. If he was coming down the hill, he would lead with his right leg, which wasn't. He wound up playing tournament squash, wrestling in the AAU. He said the only guy he ever wrestled as strong as he was, and he was amazingly strong. He could do 50 push-ups without putting his feet on the ground. And he could go up a narrow staircase with banisters on both sides without touching his feet on the ground. And he said the only guy he ever wrestled as strong as he was, they were wrestling the San Quentin team, and he was wrestling a black guy who had been on a rock pile for 12 years. And he said both of them, first thing they did when they got in the wrestling ring was to go to the mat. He said the other guy did too. He never told me who won the mat, but he was very strong. He was an aggressive lawyer, he was a testy guy, and the thing that got him in the end was a storm in Hawaii I read about here. He went body surfing by himself, got tossed up on the beach. They thought he broke his neck, and a high school classmate who was running the Space Needle in Seattle got him back. And what had happened to him, and I got the word from a surgeon who was in the Arctic with me, who was one of the many doctors that looked at his case. When his head snapped back, a little arthritic spicule had penetrated the esophagus and set up a bacterial mess around his spinal cord. They couldn't operate on it, and the circulation wasn't very good, and the drugs didn't do any good. And 3 weeks later, he became paralyzed, and he said if he couldn't walk, he didn't want to live. And a couple of days later, his brain just quit working. So Arthur Jr., who was a neurologist, neuropathologist, wanted to examine his brain stem, but the University of Washington wouldn't release it. They had it. Anyway, Yeah, we did a lot of things together, and we did a lot of things with my father. The three of us would go camping, and it's funny, my father, who smoked a lot of cigarettes and died of lung cancer, was immune to mosquitoes. I was so with mosquitoes, not bad. And my brother was terribly sensitive. He'd wake up in the morning, he couldn't open his eyes for a while. His face would be all swollen from mosquito bite. One time we were out at Cape Flattery on the northwest corner of the country on the Olympic Peninsula, and my brother and I got caught in a tide rip, and my father and a friend, Jimmy Wortham, who was an English professor at Kansas and a summit guide on Mount Rainier, were watching helplessly from the shore. And we worked our way up parallel to the coast and eventually got back in, but we were extremely cold when we got back to land. But we did a lot of things together. He was a big reader, an amazing reader. He once, on a challenge, he read 4 French novels in a day and then answered all questions on all 4 of them correctly at the end of the day. He had amazing, he did radio talk shows, he did some television stuff, he was on nationally some. He was very aggressive, very tough. And but if you asked him about a batting average of somebody in 1913, he could probably tell you. He could remember all this stuff. He was not good at math. I was the math and science guy, and he called me illiterate, you know. So anyway, we did a lot of things together, and but the house that I grew up in, this is ridiculous, but it's true. It cost my dad and his brothers a couple $1,000, I think, for the land, and they built the house. And that house sold in December of 2013 for $9.1 million. It was on the tax books for 4.5. Last year it was on the tax books for $5 million and something. And 2 doors up is the guy that bought the basketball team in Los Angeles for $2 billion. And it's all Google and Microsoft people. You could walk to Bill Gates' house and so on. During the war, it got polluted. Our drinking water came out of the lake. The intake was in 50 feet of water. My uncle ran the water system, had a water tower. Once a year, I would ride out on the lake with the diver who would go down in his diving helmet and clean out around the intake and so on. One would be Fred Blakeney. Fred Blakeney was my English teacher at Lakeside, and he he was amazing. One of the things he coaxed me into doing that I read all of the 33 or whatever Shakespeare plays while I was in his classes. He did a lot of reading. One of the things that was impressive to teenage kids, he could stand at the blackboard with his back to you and recite a poem. And while he's reciting that poem, he's writing another poem on the blackboard with his right hand and a third poem on the blackboard with his left hand, doing all this simultaneously. That was pretty impressive. Yeah, I gave him the puppy of my dog, and he had been engaged to his wife for 7 years before they married because he had tuberculosis, and he wanted to get over that before he got married. No children. And I gave him that puppy. And the last time I saw him, he was not well at his house, and that dog, he said he spent 2 hours with every day. The dog knew 36 commands, and he turned to the dog and said, "Go get my slippers." The dog runs upstairs and comes down and has his slippers in his mouth, you know. Well, he and I got to be pretty close, and he was interested in my interest in minerals and so on. And we did things like panning gold together, and we went to the petrified wood forest over in eastern Washington out of Ellensburg. And he was just such a fascinating guy. There was another fellow there, Dr. Eller, of German background, who was an excellent artist, among other things, and I did some fairly decent drawings under him. those people had a lot of, right now, over and over and over, I'm amazed at the things in English that are done, that not just by newspapers, things that were totally unacceptable to him. For instance, just to give you one example, if you're talking about Charlotte, you would say this: Charlotte, a city such as Charlotte, but you would say a city in North Carolina, like Richmond, because Richmond is not in North Carolina and Charlotte is. The difference between such and like. And it's so many distinctions of that type. In punctuation, the fact that you had to use a comma before an independent clause, and on and on. And he would have been horrified at the way some things are spelled now, and you know, on and on. And those things have stuck with me. In mathematics, the guy who taught us math, when I went to Carolina as a 16-year-old freshman, they put me in a sophomore calculus course, and I made 100 on everything except on one pop quiz. I got a 96. And the guy that was teaching the course was Dr. Archibald Henderson, who, by the way, also was the biographer for George Bernard Shaw. And I have gold medal struck with his name and my name and the Pythagorean theorem, and it is a solid gold medal, and the Henderson gold medal for mathematics to this day. But I was influenced by my teachers at Lakeside, got to know them personally, and the only one that didn't have a very good reputation as a teacher, his name was Brix, B-R-I-X. He and his brothers had both been defensive linemen at the University of Washington, and he taught American history. And from what I heard from other guys in the class, I never took a course in history. So, you know, he was not a scholar. Then when I came to Carolina, because of that influence at Lakeside, several things that I did. One of them was, whenever I went into a course, I would try to go to catch the professor after the first day, ask him if it's going to be a term paper, if we're going to be asked any research, so on, because I'd like to get an early start on it. And as a result of that, and people like Dr. Katzoff in philosophy, I remember he said 2 weeks before exams, he said, "Don't you want to get your exam? Well, why don't you come in Saturday morning and I'll give you an exam," at that time. And I said, fine. And so I come in, and he has written a question on the blackboard, discuss philosophy and life. I wrote 56 blue book pages, and when he came back 3 hours later, he took it and he said, "You got an A in the course, but I'm going to read this stuff anyway." You know? And so I had that kind of a good relationship with these people. Well, one of the things I did when I was taking an examination, if there was ever a question that I had trouble with the answer or the spelling, I would do it, make it come at the end of a line in a blue book, and I'd write it in such a way that you couldn't read it. And I knew I'd get by with it. And that was the only cheating I did, but it worked. So that's a good thing to remember.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there were other, Archibald Henderson used to invite me. He lived by himself on Franklin Street, and he would invite me over to his house for Sunday dinner. He was trying to talk me into major in math, which would have been a good thing to do, actually. But I knew a lot of my professors very well, and not just the ones in the geology department or geography. And that stood me in good stead, because they're human beings too. Now, it's not so easy now, but at Davidson you could do it, I'm sure. And so I had dinner with professors and so on, and got to know them personally. And if I'd been to Lincoln High School in Seattle, which was and is a good high school, but a huge school now, and teachers are on strike, I might not have had that inclination to get acquainted with my professors. Uh, the closest thing I had to a grandparent was an aunt. My father was born in 1882. Aunt Edith was born in 1869. But Aunt Edith was well-to-do. She wasn't rich, but she was very comfortably off. And she loved everybody in the family. And she was very strict. She would come into the house and she would tell my brother and me what you are going to do, you know. But she came by in Durham when she was in her 80s. One time she didn't like the fact we didn't have a good refrigerator, so she put a good refrigerator in the house. Next time she came back and said, you know, Tommy, you have an automobile. So she got us an automobile. And that's what she did with her money. And she was really a very strong figure in the family. My father, in his later years, was primary interests were in civil rights and in conservation. The highest peak named for man, the Olympic National Park, is Mount Clark, named for him. And he sent me off on a civil rights trip when I was a teenager. He had a classmate at Yale in 1904 whose name was William Pickens. William Pickens wrote a book, I'll think of the title, I've got the book, about his experiences. And my father sent me off with him. He was black, as though I was his son, on a civil rights mission. We went to the Grand Coulee Dam, was under construction, and he was looking at the human rights violations against Native Americans. And it was very interesting, and I was learning lots of stuff from that. Bursting Bonds is his book, William Pickens' book, Bursting Bonds. I know he told me that when he took a trip on the Pullman train, he kept a .38 revolver under his pillow just in case. And so that was my first civil rights exposure, but my father was active in that business and in conservation. And I read one book that said that he and Franklin Roosevelt were the ones that really got the credit for bringing about the Olympic National Park out of the old National Forest. So those were his big interests. But he got, like me, with macular degeneration, to where he couldn't read except talking books. He would go to the Seattle Library, and they had audio books there at that time. Remember, I had 6 years in Europe as a kid, and visited, had spent time in England, and was going to spend 6 weeks in Italy. And my brother and I were friendly with 2 girls that lived next door who were Dutch. Their father was a Davis Cup tennis player. And they got measles, and we got quarantined. Instead of having 6 weeks in Italy, we had 2 weeks in Italy, which was a big disappointment. Milan had just built Mussolini had just built the new railroad station. And I remember my parents took us to the Scala Opera and pointed out the king and queen in their box who were visiting the opera. So I had been there, and then during the war, I was in, I was in Algeria, I was in Egypt, and in India, and so on. And I had, as a geologist, I was aware of some of the physiographic or geomorphological features of the planet that interested me. Then in the Air Force, I got to fly a lot of places. The Air Force took me to Europe, Africa, Asia, Central America, and so on. So when I got out of finally retired from the Air Force in 1979 and started saying, I got to try and make some trips to some places I want to see. Then I retired from the company at the end of '87 and started right off in '88. I found I could get on a Argentinian supply ship and go to the Antarctic. And I started picking places, and the places that I wanted to get to were places such as Nepal, Tibet, Bhutan, Mongolia, the East African countries and South African countries. I took my wife down to South Africa, Zimbabwe, Botswana, and that area. She didn't go to Namibia, but I did all of the East Africa and the North African countries, and all the Central American countries, and I think all of the Asiatic countries outside of the Khans that Russia has, but from Korea and Japan and Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia. And so whenever I had a chance, I would grab a trip, and I could go space available with the Air Force. For instance, I left here one day and drove up and spent the night with a friend in Philadelphia for the night, and drove over the next morning and just lucked into a flight immediately to Greenland, to Thule. And then while I was there, the base commander, he and I had been up on the ice cap, and he said, "Would you like to go to the most northerly habited place in the world?" And I said, "Sure." So I flew co-pilot on a Royal Canadian Air Force plane to Alert up at 8230 North on the north end of Ellesmere Island. And people assigned there were not allowed, they were unaccompanied, they didn't take wives, they were assigned for 6 months, and if you got a second tour it was 3 months, because it was just, there was nothing to do, nothing to see. And in winter it was all night, you know, it was not a good place to be. But anyway, I never got, one of the places I wanted to go into the mountains of Afghanistan. And that didn't come about, I didn't do it in time. But anyway, I saw quite a lot of the planet, and those memories are good. You're talking about history. One of the things that sticks in my head, we went during the war from Oran, and from a port near Oran in Algeria to Port Said in Egypt on a ship called the Orduna. And then we got on another British ship, P&O line ship, the Strathmore, going all the way down to Bombay. But that Orduna, I looked up, and it had its own history. It was in Halifax Harbor in World War I when the biggest explosion occurred until they dropped an atom bomb. A munition ship went up in the harbor at Halifax, and it was not involved in that. In Bombay, shortly before we got there, was the second biggest explosion, another munition ship that went up. Then the Orduna was the ship that brought the Jewish refugees to this country, were refused entry. They took them to France, and they wound up in the gas chamber. And then we were on the Orduna, and it didn't survive its war years, I guess. But that ship had an amazing history.
As you yourself thinking back on experiences you've had, are you surprised? I mean, in the sense that when you were, say, my age, would you have guessed that your life would have been so diverse in terms of your experience?
How old are you now?
I'm 21.
I'm 21. Okay. Well, the day of my 22nd birthday, we were bombed by the Japanese. We'd been over there a while. And yeah, the thing that stands out in my mind, I guess, and I mentioned answering one of these questions, the World War II was a very good postgraduate course. Starting off, the first time I met the squadron commander, who was a major at the time, and when the first time I saw him, he became the operations officer for the 14th Air Force in China, the senior guy in operations. And the last time I saw him was in 1960 when I was at the in the War College in Washington. And this instructor came in, and it was Colonel Mack, who was my old commander from China. And he and his wife and my wife and I had dinner. And I got to tell you the story he told me at dinner, because he said, I'm going to tell you something I never told anybody else in the squadron. He said, and he went back, as somewhat proud to say, he went back over the hump to pick up a new airplane, a new P-38, and fly it back. And before he went over, he took up a collection for many of us that wanted to get a little American whiskey. All we got was 2 bottles of beer for Christmas. So we all pitched in some money, and he got over there, and this P-38, you could get 2 drop tanks. The drop tanks were 150 gallon or 310. Well, he had all he needed was 1 big drop tank. The other 150 gallon drop tank, he took all that money and bought rum and poured it in the drop tank. So he had all this rum. It was a brand new bought tank. So he's flying back over the hump, and he's switching over, and he realized he had switched into the wrong tank, and he quickly switched back so the engines didn't quit on it. And he got back to China, he landed, and he asked Doc Morris, Robert Morris, who came from the Mayo Clinic, who was in his early 30s, and told him what he'd done, and said that a little of the avgas may have gotten into the rum. Would it be all right to give it to these guys? And he said, the doc said, well, we'll run a test. He said, we'll take a pint of it, and you and I will split it tonight, and if we're okay in the morning, it'll be okay to give it to the troop. So we all got our rum and never heard the story until 1960 when he told us at dinner. And so you get these bits and pieces come along, you know. But the first time I saw him, he said, Clark, we're going to be on a Liberty ship, and you're going to load the ship tomorrow. So I got a truck, and I'm going down there and I got some men, and he said there'll be stevedores down there. And I expected, I get down there and I said, which dock is the ship at, you know? And they said, your ship's out there in the harbor. You're going to be going back and forth by boat, by lighter. So I had to do that. And one of the scenes that I can remember, one of the cases of bread we had busted open. And there were guys down there at the bottom of the companionway, and the guys going down the companionway. And a couple of guys started taking these loaves of bread and passing them like footballs down there. But anyway, loading that ship was my first real assignment. I realized that was a real job. I wasn't working in the shipyard or working as a powder monkey. What I was doing was taking charge. And when we were in this detached place on the Salween front, and we were the only, there were 3 of us, 3 P-38 planes, and 3 B-25 bombers. And those guys were in their tents, we were in our tents, and we were all isolated. We were a long ways from our squadron headquarters, and so were they. And we improvised, and we learned to do things. And you learn that there's no way you don't pick up the phone and call somebody or get a plumber in or something. You figure out a way to do it the best way you can. And having done that for a pretty good while was a wonderful postgraduate course before I went back into civilian life and education and on into the service. I mean, when I was, my last years, when I was assigned to the Pentagon, I didn't have any of that kind of thing to worry about. You didn't worry about where your food was coming from or the water. Our food in China was entirely by the Chinese because that was reverse Lend-Lease. The TV Sung, Madame Chiang Kai-shek's brother, negotiated with Washington. So that part of it was a very, very important part of my life and a very formative part of my life, for better or worse. And you come into a place like this and you got a medical problem of any kind, there's somebody right close by within a few miles that could take care of it, all the burden is off of you. But boy, it was on in spades then. So I think that was a key thing as far as my going from a teenager to being an adult. The war did it.